I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hopefully, later this evening or tomorrow, there will be a very, very important vote regarding the extension of long-term unemployment benefits. And what that vote is about is to make it very clear which side we are on. Are we prepared to stand with over 1 million workers and their children and say, no, we're not going to turn our backs on you, we're not going to leave you literally out on the cold worrying how you're going to heat your homes or pay your rent or put gas in your car, or as fellow Americans, we are going to stand with you and make sure that you at least have some income through extended unemployment benefits coming in to your family. Mr. President, I think as we all know, the good news is that unemployment has gone down in recent years. When President Bush left office, we were hemorrhaging over 700,000 jobs a month, clearly unsustainable, clearly a tragedy for our nation. Today, while the economy is nowhere near where it needs to be, where we want it to be, the fact of the matter is we are growing several 100,000 jobs a month. That's the good news. The bad news is that real unemployment today is close to 13% if we count those people who have given up looking for work and those people who are working part-time when they want to work full-time. And the even worse news is that long-term unemployment today is almost the highest that it has ever been on record. Today, it takes about 37 weeks for the average unemployed American to find a job. 37 weeks. Today, 37% of unemployed Americans have been out of work for more than 6 months. Today, there are 3 job applicants for every 1 job opening. And the reality is that there are simply not enough jobs for the 11 million Americans who actively seek work. And if we do not extend unemployment benefits now for this 1.3 million Americans, the situation will only become worse, and by the end of the year, we will be looking at close to 5 million Americans whose benefits will have been exhausted. Mr. President, I understand that some of my Republican friends are saying, well, yes, we are prepared to extend these unemployment benefits, but we need an offset. So let me suggest to some of my Republican friends that if that is their position, and I should point out that under President Bush, when long-term unemployment was not as serious a problem as it is today, under President Bush, time and time again, extended unemployment benefits were seen as an emergency and were passed without offsets. But if my Republican friends think that they desperately need an offset now that Barack Obama is president, let me just suggest a few of the areas that they may want to explore. Mr. President, we are losing about $100 billion every single year because corporate America is putting their money into tax havens in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and elsewhere. Well, if we need an offset, what about telling the 1 out of 4 corporations in this country who today pay nothing in federal taxes, that we're going to end their loopholes? Are we prepared to demand that corporate America start paying their fair share of taxes so that long-term unemployed Americans can afford to have food on their table or heat in their homes? Mr. President, many of my Republican colleagues think that we should repeal completely the estate tax, a tax which only applies to the top 0.3% of the wealthiest people in America. We are talking about families like the Walton family that are worth $100 billion. If some of my Republican friends think that the Walton family, the wealthiest family in America, needs another tax break, while working Americans who are desperately searching for work should not get any help at all, I would suggest to my Republican colleagues that they are way, way out of touch with the values of America and the values that make this a great country. Mr. President, I think there are some people who think that the folks who are long-term unemployed right now just don't want to work. That is grossly unfair and grossly untrue. Let me just give you a few examples. In Hagerstown, Maryland, 3,600 of our fellow citizens recently applied to work at a dairy farm to process milk and ice cream. This dairy farm will be hiring 36 people, and yet 3,600 people applied for 36 jobs. Do those people want to work? They sure do. Last October, Walmart received over 11,000 job applications for stores they are opening in Washington, D.C., and as we all know, Walmart is not the highest paying employer in America. And yet they received 11,000 applications here in the D.C. area at a time when they will be only hiring 1,800 workers. And that type of scenario is true in many, many parts of this country. An employer puts an ad in the paper, makes it known that the company needs workers, and you're seeing 10 times as many workers apply for the limited jobs. Last point that I want to make, Mr. President, is not only is this a moral issue, the issue of not turning our backs on people, some of whom have worked for their entire lives at this moment when they and their families have so much need. That's the moral issue. But there is an economic component as well. If a long-term unemployed worker does not get the average $300 check that he or she would otherwise get, what kind of money does that person have to spend locally? And what the economists tell us is that when we dry that source of spending up in communities all over this country, when people don't have the money to buy the goods and services that they desperately need, that in itself, that lack of spending, will result in several 100,000 jobs in the overall economy being lost. So not extending unemployment not only hurts the individual, but it hurts our overall economy. And the economists also tell us that not extending long-term unemployment benefits will reduce our GDP by about 0.2%. So, Mr. President, we have a moral issue, we have an economic issue, and if my Republican colleagues want offsets, there are more than enough offsets available if they are prepared to ask some of the wealthiest people in this country and some of the largest corporations in America to start paying their fair share of taxes. But the bottom line is that in an economy which today is still hurting very deeply, we cannot punish people who are severely in need. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Senator Sanders to come up here, please. That's it. Clerk will call the roll. All right.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Johnson, 50 years ago, as Senator Harkin was talking about, declared the war on poverty down the hall in the House of Representatives in his State of the Union message 50 years ago this week. A little later, he visited Athens, Ohio, in the heart of Appalachia, and he said, I came out here today to see you because we can't always see poverty from the Capitol in Washington. But you can see it when you go out and ride the rivers and the range, the mountains and the hills. When President Lincoln was in office, even though his staff said, stay in the White House, win the war, free the slaves, preserve the Union, President Lincoln would say, no, I need to go out and get my public opinion baths. I need to meet with people and talk to them and see their problems and understand their problems. Pope Francis recently exhorted his parish priests to go smell like the flock, obviously using the allegory of the sheep in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but also saying to his parish priests, understand how people live. Talk to them about their issues and their problems in their lives and live among them as much as you can. Something we, perhaps all of us, and perhaps none of us in this body, I know the presiding officer from Vermont possibly does more town halls and meetings with people than almost anybody in the Senate. All of us need to do that more to understand better. But as we debate this extension of unemployment benefits, $500 a week is the average benefit. 52,000 people in my state were cut off from benefits. At the end of the year, tens of thousands of more will lose their benefits if we don't act. It's not just what this means to a family so they can feed their families and continue to look for work. As the presiding officer knows, they need to continue to look for work in order to get this $300 a week on the average. We also know it helps the economy. Go back 100 years ago this week, Henry Ford made an announcement that stunned the country. He said, everybody in my auto plant is going to receive $5 a day. The boy, the young man sweeping the floor, the auto worker, they were all going to receive $5 a day. Whether it was done out of generosity or not, what Henry Ford knew was putting money in workers' pockets, just the same as when you put money in people's pockets for unemployment benefits, insurance they paid into that they get out, it will help grow the economy. It will help people to be able to do things they weren't able to do otherwise. That's the importance of the extension of unemployment. That's the importance of passing minimum wage legislation, which Senator Harkin also spoke about. The fair minimum wage would raise the minimum wage 90 cents upon the signature of the President, 90 cents a year later, 90 cents a year after that. At the same time, it would raise the sub-minimum wage. Those people who work in diners, who push wheelchairs in airports, who are valets at restaurants, often make less than the minimum wage. The sub-minimum wage, the tipped wage, is only $2.13 an hour, $2.13 an hour, hasn't been raised since 1991. This legislation, the Harkin, Sanders, Brown, others who are part of this legislation on the minimum wage bill, will increase the tipped minimum wage over time up to 70% of the real minimum wage. And I'll close, Mr. President, with this. I got a letter from Karen in Columbus. She said, I had to come out of medical retirement because I couldn't make ends meet. I've now worked at a department store for 4 years. I still don't make $9 an hour. My salary goes entirely toward rent and utilities. My water bill just went up $8. Now, for us in this chamber, your water bill goes up $8. Okay, you deal with it. It's not that big a deal. But she's making not even $9 an hour. It was her increase in her water bill was 1 hour's pay at this department store. My water bill went up $8 as it goes up every year, just like the electric and the gas and the food. Heaven forbid my car would break down or that I would fall victim to a serious illness. I just hope that our colleagues are getting their public opinion back. I hope our colleagues are out among people listening to these stories. I close again quoting President Johnson's speech in Athens, Ohio, 50 years ago this year. Poverty hides its face behind a mask of affluence. I call upon you to help me get out there and unmask it. Take that mask off of that face of affluence. Let the world see what we have. Let the world do something about it. Mr. President, we have an opportunity today to do something about unemployment insurance, to help people get back on their feet. We have an opportunity in the months ahead to raise the minimum wage, just to restore it to something close to what it was back in 1968 in real buying power. That should be our obligation. That should be our duty. That should be our mission in the months ahead. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business until 6:30, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I note the absence.
Mr. Alexander.
The time for debate on whether to proceed to extending unemployment benefits is up. The next step there is a procedural vote on that. Wanted to read part of a National Journal story from yesterday. It says that just because 6 Republicans joined Democrats to let the bill proceed does not mean the extension is headed for passage later this week. In fact, a number of those Republicans have said that they won't support it unless the measure is paid for. GOP lawmakers could force a second cloture vote and send the bill down unless Reid gives them reason not to. And Reid is Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. That story goes on to say now Senate Republicans are proposing a bevy of offsets and amendments and calling on Reid to let them have a vote. GOP proposals are all over the place. One from Senator Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, who voted for cloture, would pay for the benefits and roll back cuts to military pensions in the budget deal by requiring Social Security numbers for any children claimed for additional child tax credits. That in the National Journal. The next thing expected here in the Senate is a procedural vote on extending unemployment benefits. Right now, the chamber is currently in morning business with general speeches until 6:30 Eastern. A bit of background on the unemployment benefits from CQ Roll Call. Unemployed workers can receive up to 26 weeks of financial assistance, and the expanded benefits would allow them to receive up to an additional 47 weeks of assistance, depending on the state's unemployment rate. That program, created in 2008, expired at the end of December, on the 28th of December, roughly affecting 1.3 million Americans. Earlier today, Republican leader Mitch McConnell came to the floor and talked about the Senate, saying that the Senate has become a place where the sole purpose is scoring political points rather than legislating. Senator McConnell spoke for about 40 minutes. About 30 Republicans were seated in the chamber to listen to his speech. We're going to show you that now as we wait for a senator to speak.
Mr. President, over the past several years, those of us who are fortunate enough to serve here have engaged in many fierce debates. Some have been forced upon us by external events, including a searing financial crisis, while others were brought about by an unapologetically liberal president who promised dramatic change and who's worked very hard to follow through on that pledge. In some cases, even in the face of legal obstacles and widespread public opposition. So change has indeed come. Despite the daily drumbeat of headlines about gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, the truth is an activist president and a Democratic-controlled Senate have managed to check off an awful lot of items on their wish list one way or another. And yet, just as important as what they did, my colleagues, is how they did it. Because that's also been at the heart of so many of the fights we've had around here over the past few years. Now, these conflicts haven't stemmed from personal grievances or contempt, as some would have it. They are instead the inevitable consequence of an administration that was in such a hurry to impose its agenda that it neglected to persuade the public of its wisdom and then cast aside one of the greatest tools we have in this country for guaranteeing a durable and stable legislative consensus. And that tool is the United States Senate. Remember, I think we all know partisanship is not some recent innovation here, invention. American politics has always been more or less divided between two ideological camps. Today, that's reflected in the two major parties, but it's actually always been there. On one side are those who proudly place their trust in government and its agents to guide our institutions and direct our lives. On the other are those of us who put our trust in the wisdom and the creativity of private citizens working voluntarily with each other and through more local mediating institutions guided by their own sense of what is right, what is fair, and what is good. Now, recent polling suggests, by the way, that most Americans fall squarely into the latter camp. People are generally confident in their local governments, but lack confidence in Washington. And yet, despite the political and ideological divides which have always existed in our country, we've almost always managed to work out our differences, not by humiliating the other side into submission, but through simple give and take. It is the secret of our success. The same virtues that make any friendship or marriage or family or business work are the ones that have always made this country work. And the place where it happens, the place where all the national conflicts and controversies that arise in this big, diverse, wonderful country of ours have always been resolved right here in this chamber, right here. Now, I realize it may not be immediately obvious why that's the case. But the fact is, every serious student of this institution, from de Tocqueville to our late colleague Robert Byrd, has seen the Senate as uniquely important to America's stability and to its flourishing. In their view, it's made all the difference. And here's why. Because whether it was the fierce early battles over the shape and scope of the federal government, or those that surrounded industrialization, or those that preceded and followed the nation-rending Civil War, or those surrounding the great wars of the 20th century, or the expansion of the franchise, or decades-long Cold War, or the War on Terror, we have always found a way forward. Sometimes haltingly, but always steadily. And the Senate is the tool that has enabled us to find our footing almost every time. I mention this because as we begin a new year, I think it's appropriate to step back from all the policy debates that have occupied us over the past few years and focus on another debate we've been having around here. And the debate we've been having around here is over the state of this institution. What have we become? It's not a debate that ever caught fire with the public or with the press. But it's a debate that should be of grave importance to all of us. Because on some level, every single one of us has to be at least a little bit uneasy about what happened here last November. But even if you're completely at peace about what happened in November, even if you think it was perfectly fine to violate the all-important rule that says changing the rules requires the assent of two-thirds of senators duly elected and sworn, none of us should be happy with the trajectory the Senate was on even before that day, even before November, or the condition that we find the Senate in 225 years after it was created. I don't think anybody's comfortable with where we are. I know I'm not. And I'll bet even though there's nobody over here at the moment, I bet almost none of them are either. So I'd like to share a few thoughts on what I think we've lost over the last 7 years and what I think can be done about it together. Now, together obviously requires the involvement, you would think, of some people on the other side of the aisle. And even though they're not here to listen, they have been invited. So let me state at the outset, it's not my intention to point the finger of blame at anybody. Though some of that is inevitable, I don't presume to have all the answers either, and I'm certainly not here to claim that we are without fault. But I'm certain of one thing. I'm absolutely certain of one thing. The Senate can be better than it is. Many of us around here have seen a better Senate than we have now, no matter who was in the majority. This institution can be better than it is. And I just can't believe that on some level, everyone in this chamber, including the folks on the other side, doesn't agree. It just can't be the case that we're content with the theatrics and the messaging wars that go on here day after day. It just can't be the case that senators who grew up reading about the great statesmen who made their name and their mark here over the years are now suddenly content to just stand in front of a giant poster board making some poll-tested point of the month, day after day after day, and then run back to our respective corners and congratulate each other on how right we are. I just can't believe we're all happy with that on either side. Don't misunderstand me. There's a time for making a political point, even scoring a few points. I know that as well as anybody. But it can't be the only thing we do here. I mean, surely we do something other than scoring political points against each other. It cheapens the service we've sworn to provide to our constituents. It cheapens the Senate, which is a lot bigger than any of us. So hopefully we can all agree that we got a problem here. Now, I realize both sides have their own favored account of what caused it. We've got our talking points. They've got their talking points. We all repeat them with great repetition. And we all congratulate each other for being on the right side of the debate. Look, I get that. The guys over there think Republicans abuse the rules, and we think they do. But as I said, my goal here isn't to make converts on that front. My purpose is to suggest that the Senate can do better than it has been, and that we must be if we're to remain as a great nation. And I think the crucial first step of any vision that gets us there is to recognize that vigorous debate about our differences isn't some sickness to be lamented. Vigorous debate is not a problem. When did that become a problem? It's actually a sign of strength to have vigorous debates. You know, it's a common refrain among pundits that the fights we have around here are pointless. They're not at all pointless. Every single debate we have around here is about something important. What's unhealthy is when we neglect the means that we've always used to resolve our differences. That's the real threat to this country, not more debate. When did that become a problem? And the best mechanism we have for working through our differences and arriving at a durable consensus is the United States Senate. An executive order can't do it. The fiat of a 9-person court can't do it. A raucous and gregarious partisan majority in the House can't do it. The only institution that can make stable and enduring laws is the one we have in which all 50 states are represented equally.
Without objection. And, Mr. President, I ask that I be recognized for such time as I may consume as if in morning business. Without objection. Mr. President, it's kind of a little bit humorous to me that we're talking about extending the unemployment benefits in the midst of one of the most intense cold fronts in American history. I saw one newscaster yesterday who said, if you're under 40, you've not seen this stuff before. And it has to make everyone question as to whether, and I'm going to tie this together, whether global warming was ever real. While I know that the left-wing media is giving me a hard time for talking about my opposition to the administration's global warming policies when it gets cold outside, I think it's important to point out two things. One, that the administration is intentionally ignoring most recent science around global warming, and number two, that the global warming policies costing between $300 and $400 billion a year, along with the rest of the EPA's environmental regulations, are resulting in millions of job losses. Now, we're talking about extending the unemployment, and yet it's really jobs that we need, and the jobs are being robbed from us by the over-regulation that's taking place in the Environmental Protection Agency. And, of course, the crown jewel of all of those is cap and trade. Now, when I say $300 to $400 billion a year, that would constitute the largest tax increase in American history. And it's one, I find it sometimes when you're talking about these large numbers, and I'm sure the chair agrees with this, that it's hard to relate that to everyday people, to your own state, and to how it does affect our families. And so what I do is at the end of each year, I get the total number of families in my state of Oklahoma that file a federal tax return, and I do the math. In this case, it would cost about $3,000 for each family in my state of Oklahoma to pay this tax, this cap and trade tax, supposedly to stop us from having global warming. Well, it's interesting that even people now realize that this would not stop it. Even if we did something within the state of, in the country of the United States, it wouldn't affect overall emissions of CO2, and that's what they're talking about. Now, that's what makes global warming debate so important to mention as we debate the extension of the unemployment benefits. If we want to improve our employment figures, what we need to do is stop the onslaught of environmental regulations that have come out during this Obama presidency. But first, let's talk about the global warming thing. Isn't it interesting that we have often seen global warming related to events affected by unseasonable or unusually cold weather? Often this has occurred whenever Al Gore has been involved in an event. Let me give you a couple of examples. In January of 2004, Al Gore held a global warming rally in New York City, and it turned out to be what would go down as the coldest day in history in New York City. 3 years later, October of 2007, Al Gore gave a big global warming speech at Harvard University, and it coincided with the temperatures that broke Boston's 125-year-old temperature record. In March of 2009, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was snowed out of a global warming rally in Washington, D.C. because of all the snow. Her plane wasn't able to land, and they had to cancel her appearance in the event. A year later, March of 2010, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee had to cancel a hearing entitled Global Warming Impacts in the United States Due to a Major Snowstorm. I happened to be at that time, I was the ranking member of that committee, and they're all geared up, ready to have this big hearing, and they couldn't do it because of the major snowstorm. That was 2010. So this has been going on now every year for going back right now to 2007. Just last year, July of 2013, a cruise liner that was chartered to discuss the impact of global warming planned to sail through the Northwest Passage of the Arctic, but got stuck because the passage was full of ice. Now, more of that in a minute. And that same month, Al Gore had an event in Chicago training people about global warming, but was greeted with the coldest temperatures in 30 years. Now, a lot of folks, even in the last day, have said that just because there are cold temperatures doesn't mean that global warming has stopped. But in November of 2013, an executive order, the President implemented new climate change policies, very expensive ones, large tax increases, stating that, and this is a quote, excessively high temperatures are already harming natural resources, the economies, and public health nationwide. So it does matter when the ice caps are growing and temperatures increases pause for 15 years, and that's what's happened for the last 15 years. If global warming isn't happening, then there's no need for ensuing the policies, whether you call it global warming or anything else. Yeah, yesterday was a cold day. At one point, the temperature in the country was 12.8 degrees. In Chicago, It was 16 degrees below zero, and that broke the record that was set way back in 1884 when it was 14 degrees below zero. This made Chicago colder than even the South Pole at the same moment, where it was only 11 degrees below zero. Even now, down at the South Pole, a number of the ships are stuck in the ice, even though it's in the middle of the summer down there. This has been all over the news for a good reason. On November 27th, a research expedition to gauge the effect of global warming on the Antarctic began. On December the 24th, a Russian ship carrying climate scientists, journalists, tourists, and crew members for the expedition became trapped in deep ice up to 10 feet thick. An Australian icebreaker was sent to rescue the ship, but on December the 30th, efforts were suspended due to bad weather. And on January 2nd, a Chinese icebreaker, the Zhulong, sent out a helicopter that airlifted 52 passengers from the Russian ship to safety to an Australian icebreaker. The Chinese vessel is now also stuck in the ice along with the Russian vessel. 22 Russian crew members are still on board the Russian ship, and an unreported number of crew members remain on the Chinese ship. On January the 5th, the Coast Guard, that's us, we came to the rescue, called to assist the ships that were stuck in the Antarctic icebreaker. This was called the Polar Star. So our ship is on the way to help these folks out. It's just so interesting to me that so many of these activities related to global warming get canceled or affected because of cold weather, especially when you recall that just a few months ago, the journal Nature, and that was is a well-respected publication in environmental science, they published an article that said that over the last 15 years, quote, the observed temperature trend is not significantly different from zero and suggests that a temporary hiatus in global warming is not something that is appreciated by the Obama administration. What they're saying is, and this is the journal, that it has stopped. You know, let's go back. When you look back in history, you look at these cycles, and you have to come to the conclusion that God is still up there. I have this from memory, and I think I'll get this right. From 1895, they had a cold spell that came in, and that's when they said that there's another ice age is coming. That lasted until 1918. In 1918, that all changed, and all of a sudden it started getting warmer, and that's when the first terms of global warming came out. So in 1918 to 1945, it was a warming period that we went through. Then in 1945, it changed and another ice age was coming. Everyone was concerned about it. That lasted from 1945 to 1975. Then in 1975, and this is interesting because in 1975, we got into this time period that we're talking about now, and that is they're saying that global warming is coming upon us. Well, what's happening now, and they just, you know, these people have an awful lot of their time and resources and reputation at stake here. It's now to a point where that is now reversed, and we're going into another one of these cycles. The interesting thing about 1945 was the year that is recorded that the greatest surge in CO2 emissions happened during that year. That was right after World War II. And that precipitated not a warming period, but a cooling period. In December of 2008, Al Gore said the entire North Polarized Cap would disappear in 5 years. Now, the North Polar Cap is the Arctic ice cap. Well, we're now 5 years later when, as Gore said, it should all be melted by now. The deadline was December of 2013, and the Arctic ice is actually doing pretty well. Just last month, the BBC reported that the Arctic ice cap coverage is, and this is a quote now, close to 50% more than it was in this corresponding time in 2012. In other words, in 1 year, it increased by 50%. This is the very ice cap that Al Gore had said would be gone by now. So contrary to what Al Gore predicted, the ice cap didn't disappear. Last year, it grew. In May of 2006, Gore said in his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, that the Antarctic ice cap melt would result in a 20-foot increase in sea levels. You contrast that with the frozen global warming expedition down there right now in September, in a September 13th report in the Washington Post, that the Antarctic Sea has hit a 35-year high this past year. Now, these things, people don't seem to stop and think. These are predictions that were made. This is the same Al Gore that there was an article in the New York Times saying that arguably he is the world's first environmental billionaire. And all these things people are saying were gospel truth. Now we know that they are not, but nobody talks about it. The media doesn't talk about it. When you put it all together, it's impossible not to sit back and wonder if there's not this this evidence that the temperatures are actually getting colder. Should we really pursue cap and trade and other similar regulations and policies that will cost the economy $300 to $400 billion a year to implement? In light of our high unemployment levels, and that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about extending unemployment insurance. I don't think so. And that's what we're here talking about anyway, unemployment numbers, and to help remedy the problem, I'm introducing two amendments. The first one I want to talk about is Amendment number 2615. The EPA has systematically distorted the true impact of its regulations on job creation by using incomplete analyses to assess the effects of its rules on employment. They've even published that many of their regulations will result in net job creation. EPA's costly regulations, as any reasonable person knows, actually reduce business profitability and cause actual job losses. New mandates and requirements do not help the economy add jobs. For example, the EPA estimated that its 2011 utility MAC, that was passed. MAC means maximum achievable control technology. In other words, we come along in all of our great wisdom up here, and we pass a law saying how much emissions can take place, and yet there's no technology that will accommodate that. So the EPA estimated that its 2011 utility MAC, that's one that passed now, it's passed into law, rule would create 46,000 temporary construction jobs and 8,000 net new permanent jobs. By contrast, the private study conducted by NERA Economic Consulting that examined the whole economy impact of the rule, and we're talking about the utility MAC now. That's what put coal out of business in a lot of the United States. That the impact of the rule estimated that it would have a negative impact on worker incomes equivalent to 180,000 to 250,000 lost jobs in 2015, and a negative worker impact would persist at a level of 50,000 to 85,000 such job equivalents annually. The EPA estimated its cost. The cross-state air pollution rule would create 700 jobs a year. By contrast, the same NERA study estimated the rule would eliminate 34,000 jobs from 2013 through 2037. It lets you know that the EPA is controlled by the President, and they're there to fortify anything that he says, even though we have studies to show just the opposite is true. The EPA also estimated its industrial boiler MAC. Now, every manufacturer has a boiler, so this affects all manufacturers. That rule would create 2,000 jobs a year. By contrast, NERA, in their study, estimated the rule would eliminate 28,000 jobs each year from 2013 to 2037. In addition to those examples, the National Association of Manufacturers did a study that determined the cumulative impact of EPA's regulations is $630 billion annually and totals about 9 million jobs. Now, of that, the included would be the $300 to $400 billion that we'd get from cap-and-trade regulations. The EPA has not yet fully studied or disclosed the impact of these rules, but we know that it's going to be very expensive. We want to help. If we really want to do something about unemployment numbers in this nation, we need to hit the brakes on EPA's regulations. Let's don't worry about extending the time of unemployment compensation, unemployment insurance. Let's do something about the costly regulations. You know, I think everybody knows some of the disasters that are taking place in the country. They're aware of Obamacare. They're aware of what he's doing to the military. They're aware of the excessive spending that's come from his budgets. But nobody talks about the regulations, which really exceed the cost of supporting greater national debt. So my amendment does this by prohibiting the EPA from making any of its new regulations final until it complies with requirements under the Clean Air Act, Section 321. Now, Section 321 was put in back in 1977, and it was supposed to require the federal government to say and to state what the job impact will be to the various regulations. And how many times has the EPA conducted this study? Not once. So that amendment would help reduce the impact of EPA's rules on job loss. My second amendment would actually help create jobs. It's really kind of unrelated to this, but since I'm talking about two amendments that are very significant now and would resolve our jobs problems to a great extent, it's amendment number 2605, and it would help us take advantage of our vast domestic oil and gas resources. We've seen huge increases in oil and gas development in recent years due to the advancements in precision drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and other technologies. These technologies have unlocked the shale revolution, and because of this, official government estimates now predict that we'll become completely energy sufficient by 2035. What they won't tell you is that this could happen a lot faster. Right now, 83% of the federal lands are currently off limits for oil and gas developers. This is not a good reason. There's not a good reason for this. It's just the administration preventing us from having more jobs and energy independence. So you got to keep in mind, we now and then hear people from the Obama administration saying, well, wait a minute, during the last 4 years or 5 years, the production has increased by some 40%. Well, but that's all on state property and on private land. On federal land, it's actually decreased by about 15% because of the war against fossil fuels that's taking place out of the White House. So the amendment that I'm offering would give these resources to the states to unlock and develop on their own. I mean, the assumption here is the states should be in a better position to know what they want to do with these regulations in their own state and any damage that might come to the environment. Let them make that decision instead of the federal government doing it. A recent report by the Institute for Energy Research estimated that if we completely developed these off-limit federal resources, it would create 2.5 million jobs and generate $14.4 trillion in economic activity, but it would also help us achieve energy independence by 2024, 11 years sooner than it would otherwise. So if we want to create jobs, this is how we can do it. We should embrace our energy future and aggressively expand production. If we want fewer people to lose their jobs in the future, we should prevent the EPA's regulations from moving forward, at least until they fully study the impact of the rules that will have on job losses. We've been trying to do this now for a long period of time to determine what these cost. And if when the American people find out in terms of the dollars it costs and the jobs that are lost with excessive regulations, they will come and let their feelings be known, certainly at election time. With that, I will yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've come to the floor today like so many of our colleagues, to talk about the urgent need to pass legislation to extend unemployment insurance. I was encouraged, as I know many of us were, that the Senate voted on Monday to move to this legislation, and I really hope that we're able to build on that progress and to pass this critical assistance this week. Emergency unemployment insurance has always had bipartisan support. Congress has acted 8 times since 1958 under congressional leadership and presidents from both parties to establish extended benefit programs when the unemployment rate is too high. And in fact, as I think a number of my colleagues have said, the program that we're currently looking to extend was actually passed when George W. Bush was president, with strong bipartisan support. It's important that we don't turn our backs on Americans who are struggling to find work right now. And we really can't afford the economic consequences of inaction. Failing to renew unemployment benefits will cost us jobs, it will hurt economic growth, it will eliminate a critical lifeline for families who are struggling to make ends meet. And while New Hampshire's unemployment rate is below the national average, if you're out of work, your household is 100% unemployed. And there are too many families in New Hampshire who have already been hurt by the expiration of these benefits. According to New Hampshire's Governor Maggie Hassan and our state's Employment Security Commissioner George Kapatis, the lapse in this critical program has abruptly cut off vital support for about 1,350 individuals in New Hampshire. And for each week that extended benefits are not available, an additional 500 to 600 New Hampshire citizens will exhaust regular unemployment insurance coverage. In total, more than 8,500 citizens of New Hampshire could be hurt over the course of the next year, and that would result in a potential loss to our economy of as much as $14 million, according to the state of New Hampshire. And it's a particular issue in certain pockets in the state. There are counties where the unemployment rate is higher, where we have more long-term unemployed who are going to find particular concern about trying to find a job if they don't have any help while they're looking. So, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the letters from New Hampshire's Governor Hassan and from our Commissioner of Employment Security be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. As these letters show, the impacts of a failure to extend unemployment benefits are very real for thousands of working families in New Hampshire. And of course,